Welcome to the Simplify lecture 10.2, Nip in the Bud. We have a quote from Edvard Munch. From my rotting body, flowers shall grow, and I am in them, and that is eternity. Our learning goals for this lecture is to describe reproduction in flowering plants, describe response to stimuli. We already know plants evolve from green algae, that plants evolve systems for surviving on land, including a well-developed vascular system and differentiated cell structures for support and protection. In the lab, we learned that flowers contain both carpels and stamen, that the number of carpels and stamen vary by flower, and plants cannot be identified purely by gender. So plant cells that are undifferentiated and cell division is frequent, we call these meristematic cells. Recall the stem cell discussion from animal systems. This is kind of similar. So in the cambium for lateral growth, this is where we see these tree rings where it grows outward. Down just above the root cap at the tip where we're going down, there's some meristematic cells. They're protected by the root cap, and that's how we grow down. Let's start naming some parts. We saw these in the lab. So we have the sepal and the petal. The sepal is the outer part. That's the very, very base, the outer part of the flower. It's the parts you see on the outside when it's still closed as a bud. Protects it from cold and injury. Whenever it opens up, you can see the petals above the sepal. It's a softer colored part that kind of focuses everything in. It's softer, attracts insects. We can see some real pictures here. The sepals are the little stronger, little thicker part on the outside. They can be green, they can be colored, and the petals surround that. We have these anthers and filaments. Different flowers will have different numbers of them. The anthers where the pollen is produced. The filament is a support structure to hold the anthers up and to put them in the right position so that they can be spread. Now the anther and the filament together form a larger structure that we call the stamen. The stamen is the combination of an anther and its filament. If we look at some real pictures, we can see that that whole piece there is the stamen. The little pollen-y part at the top, that is the anther. The filament is just the part that is lifting up the anther and putting it in position. We see several different examples of how they look. Now, the other parts that are in there, we have a stigma, style, and ovary. So the stigma is the sticky part here at the very top. It's where pollen actually germinates at. It's where the pollen goes from the anther. It's eventually going to stick to a stigma. The style is kind of the little stem, little support structure. The style here serves the same function as the filament did there. The ovary is at the bottom. It has ovules on the inside, and that's what's going to eventually become the seeds. Now this entire structure right here, the stigma, style, and ovary combined, become the pistil. One of these would be a carpel. Multiple carpels become the entire pistil. We see some examples here, including a cross section, so we can see inside that. Again, the pistil is the whole thing all together. Sometimes we'll see separate carpels, sometimes we'll see carpels fused. The stigma is the sticky part at the top. The style is just serving to hold up the stigma, and the ovary is there at the very bottom part where those ovules are contained. So the stamen is the male part. The pollen has an adaptation that produces sperm cells, and then the ovary has the ovules inside. That's the female part. And together, that's our reproductive organs. We generate the two different sick cells through the similar processes that we've studied in the earlier units this semester. And we get this cycle that goes on here. So the anther has all these pollen seeds where we can generate these sperm cells that go to the stigma, and then those go through a pollen tube where they'll combine with the ovules, and we'll start to see the fertilization. In this diagram, we have some of it colored in yellow and some in blue. The yellow parts are where we see the haploid, a single set of genetic material, and the blue parts are where we have the full diploid, the double set of genetic material. You see my anther starts with the mother cells here, and then they go through meiosis, and we end up with these microspores, these pollen grains that end up with these generative cells that can be stuck to the stigma, forms a pollen tube, and this is where the actual sperm is released so that it can go down to where the egg is and go through fertilization to end up with this embryo that'll be protected in the seed. Once the seed is in the right spot, it'll grow until we repeat the process all over again. We see that there's always two processes going on here in these flowering plants. So there's the line on the outside where we make these haploidal pollen to sperm, but then in the ovary, the ovules are going through meiosis to make the egg that's going to be fertilized there and go through and go back to the cyclical process again. Pollination can go through cross-pollination or self-pollination. In cross-pollination, it's the pollen from one anther of a flower moves to the stigma of another flower of the same species. So we're having sexual reproduction. In self-pollination, the pollen from a flower's anther move to its own stigma, combining the two. Some plants do only cross-pollination. Some plants do self-pollination. Some plants do both. Let's look at this developing question. If a plant self-pollinates, is it a male or a female? Well, it has anthers and it has stigma, but trying to describe it as male or female is really trying to describe it in kind of a human society. Flowers just don't work like that. You don't have boy flowers and girl flowers. Okay, here's a proficient level question. Can you label all these parts? Pause and label them all. Here are those structures labeled. So in the middle we see all the parts together, and so we're labeling the anther and the filament separately. On the left we see that the combination, you see that the rest kind of grayed out. The anther filament together is called the stamen, and on the right we see the stigma style and the ovary with the ovules inside all highlighted with the rest grayed out. That together is called the pistil. Let's look at a mastery question. What are the advantages and disadvantages of cross-pollination versus self-pollination? Well, with cross-pollination, you have an advantage in sexual reproduction because of all the variation and diversity, because you're combining genes with different organisms. Now you have to rely on pollinators, though. For self-pollination, it's reliable. It saves energy because you don't have to just make the fancier, prettier flowers, but you have less diversity because you're not combining genes, which means you have less disease resistance and less adaptability and variation. So, stimuli and response. Plants are living creatures. Living creatures respond to stimuli. Plants respond to stimuli. Stimulus response, stimulus response. Don't you ever think? An example of the stimulus response is a word that we call phototropism. This is photo, from the Greek for light, and tropos, from Greek meaning turning, as in this case a response to a stimuli. So phototropism is how a plant responds to the stimulus of light. Now at this point we need to have an interesting but important conversation about anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is a normal part of human psychology. What it means is it's the way that humans like to attribute human characteristics, such as motions, to things that are not human. Plants don't have thoughts. don't have feelings, don't have desires. They don't choose to move towards the light because they like the light. They don't like anything. They don't have opinions. In this case, it's simply a biochemical reaction. It's this movement of these oxygen molecules. You end up with more on the dark side and less on the light side, which elongates the dark side, which bends it towards the light side. That's something that's evolved over time because plants that could do that had an advantage. It doesn't have anything to do with their choices. They don't have consciousness. We like to do this all the time because it makes it easy for us to understand things. We say that atoms like to have a certain number of electrons, that plants like to get this, that cells prefer to do that. But we have to be clear that whenever we do these things, we're doing them by analogy. That's not exactly how it works, but it's a good analogy of how it works. So it's a very useful way for us to communicate. We just need to be honest that what we're engaging in is something called anthropomorphism. Another example is geotropism. It's how a plant responds to the stimulus of gravity. So we'll keep growing upright even if you let a plant grow from a little ways and then you knock it over, or if there's some kind of shift in the soil or erosion. Sometimes you'll see trees that have funny bends in their trunks or things like that. They were growing straight when that part was going originally, but then something happened, there was a shift, and now what's up was a different direction, and so they bend and turn. It's the same chemicals, actually, that happened in our phototropism, the auxins. They are pulled down by gravity, which makes that part elongate until it evens out. Plants are really good at detecting the gravity and growing straight up because they're trying to get closer to the light. Sometimes you'll hear geotropism called gravitotropism. Gravito as in gravity. Thigmotropism. Thigmo responds to touch. So this is how plant responds to the stimulus of touch. This happens a few different ways. On the left, some plants, whenever they're touched, will fold their leaves so they look withered. That way if an herbivore or something eating them comes close and starts touching them, all the leaves fold up and look less appetizing. In the middle picture, we see how vines work. A plant will rotate out these little tiny feelers, and whenever they touch something, it activates a reaction that causes it to extend the growth, and they wrap around those things. Or on the right side, we see the famous Venus flytrap. There's a thigmotropism that happens. Whenever it's opened, in the sense of touch, it closes, trapping the thing, so it can slowly be digested. We also have a process called transpiration. Transpiration is when water evaporates straight from a plant, straight through the leaves, straight into the air, the loss of water. So this is a process that happens a lot, and our plants do try to control it. So we have those stomata that are guard cells. They can respond to control by opening and by closing. If we look in the photograph on the right, that guard cell is closed. The two black and white images in the middle are electron micrographs to see the open position and the closed position. What's in the middle is simply a hole that allows inside and outside to come. And so the guard cells are simply opening and closing the barrier. So closure happens in times of drought, whenever we have immune responses, acidics. The light and carbon dioxide will cause them to open, among other stimuli. Let's look at a developing question. Why do we anthropomorphize plants? It helps us understand them. It helps us relate to them. It puts them in context of our personal experiences. Would a plant that has geotropism grow in the same way that it does on Earth on the International Space Station? Well, not exactly. They tend to grow out in all kinds of different directions, roots, vines, stems, all kind of spreading out. Whatever the light source is, we'll see the phototropism will take over and be a primary director for growth. A mastery question. What is the evolutionary advantage to phototropism, geotropism, and thigmotropism? Use the clear method to justify one of the three. Remember, clear means to stake a claim, cite evidence for that claim, and discuss the reasoning to connect the evidence to the claim. So what's the evolutionary advantage to phototropism? Plants require light for photosynthesis to acquire energy in their organic molecules. The evidence is that as plants go through phototropism, they're able to get more light, and that gets more photosynthesis. The reasoning is because of this increased, they're constantly moving towards, they're able to be more efficient, and their structures are able to get more light with less energy, which ends up with more efficient plants. The same thing with geotropism. We're heading in a direction that's towards the sun. We're not growing in a direction that's useless. And thigmotropism is a little more varied because of the several different reasons that we discussed.